There's something strange about people born in the 1990s. They remember a world that no longer exists, but they also helped build the one replacing it. They grew up riding bikes until the streetlights came on, but also remember spending hours customizing a MySpace profile with glitter GIFs and autoplay music. They used paper maps, burned CDs, rented movies from Blockbuster, and memorized landline phone numbers. But they also became the first generation fully absorbed into social media before adulthood was even finished. And that split did something to them. Psychologists are starting to notice that people born in the 90s occupy a very specific psychological position in human history. Not fully analog, not fully digital, raised one way, forced to adapt another. Old enough to remember life before the internet took over everything, but young enough that the internet still shaped who they became. If you were born between 1990 and 1999, you are part of the only generation that will ever experience both worlds clearly enough to compare them honestly. And the weird part is, most of you don't even realize how much that shaped your mind. Picture this. It's 2001. You're sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of a giant box TV. Saturday morning cartoons are on. Pokemon, SpongeBob, Dexter's Laboratory. Maybe you're eating cereal directly from the bowl while your parents are still asleep. Nobody's checking your location. Nobody's texting you every 10 minutes. Nobody's recording your life for an audience. When the cartoons end, you go outside. Not because someone forced you to, because that's what kids did. You knocked on your friend's door without texting first. You rode bikes through neighborhoods for hours. You got bored, which forced your imagination to wake up. A stick became a sword. A sidewalk crack became lava. An empty lot became an entire universe. And here's what researchers find interesting about that kind of childhood. Unstructured play forces the brain to develop creativity differently. When children aren't constantly entertained, their minds learn how to generate stimulation internally. That matters more than people think. Today, boredom gets eliminated almost instantly. A child feels uncomfortable for 4 seconds and reaches for a screen. But 90s kids grew up in a world where boredom was unavoidable. And because of that, they learned how to sit with their own thoughts. But then something happened. Technology didn't slowly enter your life. It exploded into it while your brain was still developing. You remember dial-up internet, that sound, the weird screeching modem, the way nobody could use the phone while you were online. You remember waiting 20 minutes for a single song to download on Napster, only for it to turn out to be the wrong version. You remember when getting on the internet actually felt intentional. Then suddenly broadband arrived, and YouTube, then Facebook, then smartphones. Then social media stopped being a place you visited and became the environment you lived inside. And that transition happened during the exact years your identity was forming. That's important, because older generations built their sense of self before the internet existed. Younger generations never had to develop without it. But 90s kids had to psychologically migrate from one reality into another while becoming adults at the same time. That creates a kind of mental split. Researchers sometimes call this transitional generation psychology. People raised during periods of massive technological change often develop higher adaptability, but also more identity confusion and nostalgia, because part of them still belongs to the world that disappeared. And for 90s kids, that disappeared world feels deeply personal. You remember when moments existed without documentation, when embarrassment faded instead of living online forever, when friendships happened face-to-face instead of through streaks and notifications, when people disappeared after school and you simply didn't know what they were doing until Monday morning. Privacy used to be normal. Now it feels luxurious. And because you experienced both worlds, you constantly compare them, whether you realize it or not. That's where the nostalgia comes from. It's not really about VHS tapes or old cartoons or flip phones. It's about remembering what it felt like to exist before constant performance, before every opinion became content, before your worth became measurable in likes, followers, views, and engagement. One study on memory and nostalgia found that humans don't actually miss the past as much as they miss the emotional state they associated with it. The past feels simpler because your brain filters out the stress and preserves the emotional texture. And the emotional texture of a 90s childhood was very different from today. Life felt slower, attention felt deeper, experiences felt more private. You could disappear for hours and nobody panicked. You could fail socially without a digital record haunting you forever. You got to figure out who you were without performing that process for an audience. That's something younger generations may never fully experience. But here's where the story gets darker. Studies consistently show rising levels of anxiety and depression among people born in the 90s. Researchers point to social media, economic instability, information overload, and constant comparison as major causes. But the deeper issue might be this. You were raised with analog nervous systems inside a digital world. Your brain evolved expecting periods of silence, boredom, face-to-face connection, and uninterrupted presence. Instead, adulthood arrived with endless notifications, algorithmic stimulation, and social comparison operating 24 hours a day. And because you remember what life felt like before all that, the contrast hits you harder than it does younger generations who never knew anything else. That's why so many 90s kids feel simultaneously exhausted by technology and completely dependent on it. You know the machine is draining you, but your career, relationships, entertainment, and identity now exist inside the machine, so you can't fully leave it behind. You're stuck between nostalgia and adaptation. And honestly, that can feel emotionally disorienting. One minute you're scrolling endlessly on TikTok, the next minute you're watching an old Cartoon Network intro on YouTube, and suddenly feeling emotional over a sound effect you haven't heard in 20 years. That's not random. Memory is tied heavily to sensory experience. Music, visuals, smells, commercial jingles, startup sounds. They bypass logic and hit emotion directly. And because the 90s and early 2000s were the last era before life became fully personalized by algorithms, everyone shared more of the same cultural experiences. Entire generations watched the same shows at the same time, listened to the same songs on the radio, played the same games, waited for the same movies to release. Culture felt collective. Now everything is fragmented into individual feeds, and 90s kids remember both systems. That gives them a strange kind of perspective. They understand convenience, but also understand what convenience cost us. They understand connection, but also understand the loneliness hidden inside hyperconnectivity. They understand customization, but also miss the feeling of shared experiences. And maybe most importantly, they know what uninterrupted presence feels like. That's why many people born in the 90s still crave things that seem oddly old-fashioned now. Physical books, vinyl records, long walks without phones, road trips, disposable cameras, campfires, silence. None of that is really about aesthetics. It's about recovering the psychological state modern life keeps interrupting. And here's the ironic part. The exact generation most fluent in technology is also the one most aware of its costs. Because you remember before. You remember when social interaction wasn't optimized, when boredom existed long enough to turn into creativity instead of scrolling, when people experienced moments instead of immediately converting them into content. That memory changes you. It makes you skeptical of modern life in a way younger generations often aren't yet. But it also makes you adaptable. That's the strength hidden inside all this. 90s kids became translators between worlds. You can explain smartphones to your parents and explain VHS tapes to Gen Z. You understand both delayed gratification and instant access. You can navigate digital systems while still remembering human rhythms that existed before everything accelerated. That balance matters, especially now, because modern culture keeps moving toward faster, louder, shorter, more stimulating experiences. And people who remember another way of living become important. Not because the past was perfect. It wasn't. But because remembering alternatives prevents you from believing the current system is the only way humans can live. That's what 90s kids really carry. Not just nostalgia, perspective. You are the generation that watched the world transform in real time. You saw what humanity gained. You also saw what it traded away. And living between those two truths creates a strange emotional tension most people can't fully explain. You're not fully comfortable in the old world anymore, but you're not fully at home in the new one either. You belong to both, which means sometimes you feel like you belong completely nowhere. But maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's awareness. Maybe being caught between worlds allows you to see both more clearly than the people standing fully inside either one. And if you've been feeling unusually nostalgic lately, if random sounds or old internet aesthetics hit you harder than they should, If part of you misses a version of life you can't even fully describe, there's probably a reason for that. You're not really mourning the 90s. You're mourning a feeling, a slower attention span, a quieter mind, a life that wasn't constantly being watched, measured, optimized, and performed. And the strange thing is, that feeling might not be completely gone. It might just be buried underneath all the noise.